Hi, good morning. My name is Steyn Heckroodt. I'm an international business consultant focusing on business challenges on the African continent. I'm also a part-time faculty member here at the University of Stellenbosch Business School and also the executive development programs. This morning I'm discussing a book on Reinventing Management. It's written by Julian Birkinshaw, who is a professor in strategic and international management and also deputy dean at the London Business School. Birkinshaw helps business managers and leaders of today to understand their management models, to evaluate them, and to rethink the way in which they achieve objectives and goals in an organization. Following is an edited version of my presentation. We'll start with a little bit of an introduction on management, more specifically the challenges of management. He then defines the concept of management model, which is an interesting concept. It's not really new, but it gives it a very nice framework to work with. And then the next 4 chapters, he takes the 4 definitions of management that he has identified, which is coordinating activities, making and communicating decisions, setting objectives, and motivating people in the organization. Each one of those he discusses per chapter, and then also discusses the evolution from the traditional pole or principle of those dimensions to alternative ones. So for instance, if you look at coordinating activities, typically how we do it today is we work by means of bureaucracy. That would be his traditional or current principle or pole. And then the alternative one to that would be emergence. And he describes the different steps in terms of that evolution and assist organizations to find and plot yourself in terms of where you are currently in terms of that model. So he does that in the next 4 chapters, and then chapter 7, he pulls all of those together in a 2-dimensional matrix, which then creates 4 generic business models from which organizations can then choose. You might be using some of it already, or there might be room for, once again, evolvement to selection of a different management model as opposed to the one you're using currently. And then if you want to implement change, he ends off these 2 chapters with 1, the agenda of the change the change agent in the organization, either internally or externally, and also ends off with the leader's agenda in terms of implementing these changes. All right, so let's start off. What I've found particularly useful about the book is that the examples Birkinshaw uses is very current. He obviously elaborates a lot and spends a lot of time or dedicates many pages to what has happened over the past 2-3 years insofar as the economic crisis that we are still in. As a matter of fact, things in some respect have got a little bit worse than what it was before. It's also very unpredictable. But he spends a lot of time in contextualizing what he calls the failure of management in the context of today's current economic crisis that we're experiencing. He uses examples. Many of the companies in the book, if you read the book, you will recognize the name because it's been in the news so often. Lehman Brothers is just one that he spends a lot of time on, and then he tries to extrapolate what those organizations did incorrectly or wrongly insofar as management is concerned. In the case of Lehman Brothers, talks about poor risk management, perverse incentive schemes. Now, perverse incentive schemes, he calls it perverse, but let's just call it incentive schemes. It's not something that is unique to Lehman Brothers. Many organizations we find has got incentive schemes where people are incentivized primarily materially by means of money and bonuses to perform at a certain level to satisfy specifically stakeholder interest in the form of shareholders. Chapter 1, really, my advice in terms of reading the book, read chapter 1 twice. Don't just read it once. Read it twice, then you have a very thorough understanding and a structure and a framework in your mind about what the book is about. Management is defined in chapter 1. He talks about the corruption, and it's not about whether you agree or not. Just read it for what it is. It gives interesting perspectives. Talks about the failure, and then he positions the book as exploring sort of reinventing management, looking at it in new ways. Okay. So chapter 2, very much an introduction of this management model concept, and then providing tools for us to take our current management model and start looking at newness around the 4 dimensions: coordination of activities, motivating people, making decisions, defining objectives. So the formal definition there, you can have a look there. It's management model, choices made by executives of a company regarding how they define objectives. Those 4 definitions, once again. In other words, how they define how work of management gets done. So it's very much a how-to It's important for you to understand this slide because it goes to understanding the book. This is the framework of the book. Chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6. The 4 dimensions, let me give you the 4 dimensions that you see there. First and foremost, coordinating activities, making and communicating decisions. Then from there, setting objectives, and from there, motivating people. Now, even though this is presented sequentially, we all know that in practice it doesn't happen sequentially. How we manage them, however, he introduces a way in which we can look at them, and that is where those principles comes in. If you look at coordinating activities, he introduces bureaucracy on the one side, and then he produces emergence on the other side. And the arrow indicates some sort of an evolutionary development of that dimension in terms of the mechanisms that we are currently using. So that's the word in brackets. And he then does the same with the other dimensions, making and communicating decisions. There again, he talks about the principle. Strictly speaking, that's how it works, and then he progresses again by means of evolution from that to an alternative pole, which is collective wisdom. So you see managing objectives would be approach, and the last one would be drivers. This is now just in a little bit more detail. I'm going to give you a tool quickly. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. We have dealt with most of this on a high level, so you understand the framework by now. A very, very practical tool, because the question is this: how do I determine where I am now currently as an organization in terms of those current and alternative poles? Am I more on the bureaucracy side? Am I more towards emergence? Where am I? It gives a very, very practical tool. It's 8 questions, and then by means of a Likert scale of 4 options, you can hand those questionnaires out to your managers, to people in the organization, and they will then indicate to you on the left-hand side. Number 1 there is outputs are created through management processes, i.e. the formal coordination of inputs and structuring of effort. And now in these 2 columns here, you can now by means of a tick or a cross just indicate, here I strongly agree with this statement, and here I marginally agree with this statement. Now straight across on the top there, it says outputs are created through mutual and i.e. the informal and spontaneous coordination, so that's more on the emergence side. Okay, so that's what you have. As I said, I'm not going to go into the detail, you can get it in the book, but very practical, 8 questions. Question 1 and 2 goes to the first dimension, 3 and 4 to the second, 5 and 6 to the third, and 7 and 8 to the last one. And then you get this plotting matrix, which I have done there by those blue dots. So at the end of the day, it should be possible for you to get a picture of your organization and say, okay, well, this is where we are. So what he now says, and he draws this, this line is actually more of a curve. And what he says here is, again, what you see there, those mechanisms, flexible bureaucracy, internal market model, network model, those are all mechanisms. So remember, we're busy with dimension number 1, which is coordination of activities. I have 2 poles. I have bureaucracy and I have emergence. What are the mechanisms that I would use to achieve coordination of my workforce? Internal market model would be something that I think most organizations have tried and are still using very effectively. It's when you start to work with the other departments almost as your client. The network model is where you expand those relationships, treating other people as clients, you expand it outside of the organization. And that's not the contract side of it. The contract side of it would be pure market model. And from there, let's evaluate it. And evaluation really is where you look at the merit of this mechanism and say, is it still appropriate? Is this something that works for us as an organization? Communicating with subordinates, gaining input from subordinates on decisions. Right, using subordinates to solve problems and innovate, where you're starting to hand down more, starting to take a little bit of a bolder step, you're starting to trust subordinates to see how they are going to do this on their own. Making use of external input to improve decision making. Obliquity is an interesting word. All it means is that as opposed to making alignment towards goal a direct alignment, I make it an indirect alignment. So an example would be something what he calls the pursuing an indirect goal, or the second one, pursuing a creative goal. It's a challenge of a lot of organizations these days. I would urge you to spend quite a bit of time on this chapter. And that challenge is, we are still doing what we've used to be doing the past 10, 20, 15 years. Have we really embraced the new technology? The pursuing leap of faith goal is just total newness. It's almost a higher level decision where I'm deciding, okay, yes, this is what we've always been doing, but we're now going to do something totally different, regardless of the consequences on all the other departments in the organization. Okay, you find that in some organizations as well. So again, at the end of this chapter, again, what you do, understand, evaluate, envision, and experiment with newness. Last one is key. I think this is probably the chapter that he saved for last. I think in some respect it's the most important one because it goes to motivating people. And it's a challenge to everybody. He breaks it down into 3. Once again, now here I have drivers. Okay, so first one was mechanism, second one was features, third principles, third one was approaches towards setting objectives, and this one is the driver. What do I use? Money, wealth, material drivers, bonuses, incentives. The second one to that is more social, promotion, status, importance in the society. And the last one there is personal drivers. That's where job fulfillment comes into play. So that's the evolution, and he makes a strong argument to move here. But at the same time, he says, please don't ignore number 1. It's an old fact. People say people aren't motivated by money. I don't know. The book's out on that. Who of you are going to do your work next month without pay? Okay, so money is an important part. It might not necessarily be the motivator, be all and end all. It might not be the tool or the driver that you're going to use to achieve success in your organization, but it is important. And that's the evolution where he goes from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation. And he also splits it in terms of generation, theory X, theory Y. We've spoken a little bit about that. Very quickly, chapter 7, he then pulls these 4 definitions together by means of a 2-dimensional matrix, which gives you 4 generic management models. Science, planning, quest, and discovery. Once again, not good, not bad, appropriate to an organization, a type of business in a specific industry. Coordinating people and making decisions, that's the means. For the ends is to achieve my objectives and to keep people motivated. Planning typically would be a McDonald's. Everything is planned, structured, very, very mechanistic. It works for them. It enables them to change their menu all across the world within 24 hours, even less, by the push of a button. Science model, very much a technological organization, so you can see that the means here, how I need to get where I want to get, is very tight. But the ends is a little bit loose. Sometimes you will tell your IT department, look, just play with it, see what comes out of it. You can't necessarily put something out there and say, this is absolutely 100% that you need to achieve. You find this with a lot of technological or internet organizations. So it's the loose, loose, tight, tight, and you need to find an in-between. Discovery up there, loose and loose. Google. Google is a classic example of a discovery where everybody's out there, and you must have seen the videos where they play pool at work and they bring their pets and their kids and everything else. And at the end of the day, there's a whole lot of apps that's being developed, and from that, the owners or the executives will then nitpick and say, well, this is the next offering, that's the next. And they're leading in their industry. If you then want to bring about change in the organization, he talks about the change agent's agenda. There's 3 levels from which I can drive change in the organization: middle management, senior management, and external by means of a consultant. That's according to Birkinshaw. And that's typically where I would initiate and drive change from. And then he gives us a couple of tips. Figure out the degrees of freedom that you have in the organization and use it. Second to that, build internal and external allies, people that you can sort of lobby. And it's not company politics, but you need support if you want to start changing the way in which things get done. Take an experimental approach. Start trying out new things, okay? Give it a name, a project, Project X, and then seek support from above, okay? Get buy-in from above. No matter how we look at it, organizations essentially are driven from the top down, not in a negative sense, but the leadership, the guidance, the clarity needs to come from the top. Okay, and then last slide is the leader's agenda. So, and that's where he brings leadership and management together very nicely. And this is essentially what he says from a managerial point of view the leader should be doing. Is take those 4 steps: understand, evaluate, envision, and experiment. And the understanding might mean that I need to have discussions around strategically what I am doing in the organization. Are we understanding what we are doing? And is there a match between where we're going, what we want to do, and the appropriateness of our management model? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the book.